On today's World Insight with Ken Wei,
不以任何人的意志为转移。
BRICS nations look for solutions while the world grapples with trade wars. And the United States and the EU agree to hash out trade issues, trying to avoid a full-scale trade war. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Ken Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. The first story of today, the leaders of BRICS nations are gathering in Johannesburg, South Africa for this year's annual summit. The theme is collaboration for inclusive growth and shared prosperity in the fourth industrial revolution. It may sound abstract, but there are a lot of issues that is actually being discussed. Before we go to our panel about this, let's take a look at this.
A symbol of goodwill at the annual BRICS Summit. It comes at a time when the world is facing challenges of unilateralism and protectionism.
时代大潮奔腾不息。
The trend of history continues to move forward, independent of people's wishes. We BRICS countries must therefore have a keen grasp of the trend of our times, deepen our strategic partnerships, and consolidate our cooperation framework that are underpinned by economic, political, and security cooperation and people-to-people exchanges. This way, we will turn our vision of a second golden decade into a reality and build a community with a shared future for mankind.
携手迈向人类命运共同体。
Earlier on Thursday, President Xi met with his Brazilian counterpart Michel Temer. President Xi stressed that the two countries should strengthen cooperation in all areas and to push forward the high-quality growth in trade. President Temer said Brazil attaches great importance to the Belt and Road Initiative, and the two countries should enhance communication in both international and regional affairs. At the BRICS Business Forum on Wednesday, President Xi said a trade war should be rejected, as there will be no winner.
各方切实遵守共同。
The BRICS countries must uphold multilateralism. We should urge all parties to fully observe collectively adopted international rules, and we should treat all countries as equals, regardless of their size, and address issues that matter to all through consultation and oppose hegemony and power politics.
共同综合合作可持续的安全观。
The BRICS nations make up 40% of the world's population and contributed to 23% of global GDP last year. President Xi says only by opening up can these countries achieve shared prosperity and sustainable development.
For more discussion on the BRICS Summit, we are joined in our Beijing studio Professor Fu Jun, who is an academic dean of the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development with Peking University. Welcome, Professor. In Johannesburg, South Africa, Dr. Cobus van Staden, senior researcher with the China-Africa in South Africa Institute of Foreign Affairs. Welcome as well. Dr. Staden, let me start with you. This time, not only the BRICS Summit, but also Chinese President's state visit to South Africa. Tell me exactly, China and South Africa have in mind about how to resolve some of the biggest issues of the world today, particularly regarding trade and particularly regarding China and Africa development through Belt and Road.
China and South Africa are key partners in developing China-Africa cooperation. South Africa has provided a lot of support, I think, for China's work in Africa, and the two ruling parties of the two countries are quite close. I think they are increasingly trying to put together alternative trade communities that can ameliorate, some of the problems relating to trade in the international field. And in the process, they're trying to put up alternative markets and alternative global value chains to try and move around some of the hegemonies that we've seen in the global order.
Very interesting the way you're talking about it, the alternative way of addressing the trade issues today. Professor Fu from Beijing, do you agree with that? Will BRICS be able to play that role?
Well, I would use a different word to describe different market segments globally. China has moved the global technology ladder from a low end to middle end, and when we look forward, it's advanced economies. When we look this way, it's less advanced economy. So it makes a lot of sense for China to develop, to strengthen its relationship with the less developed economies, so that you take advantage of the complementarities between China and the less
well, that sounds like
countries.
the original idea why BRICS was created, but 10 years already passed. So, and we are in an interesting and new juncture, shall we say, of the world. The trade issues is really becoming the headlines of the world. So, in that sense, how is this what you call look forward, look back, so-called in a way, be able to help China to figure out the solution together with the others of the BRICS?
Well, it's important for you to point out some of the external challenges that China faces, and in the face of those challenges, it is even more important for China to look this way, to strengthen collaborations with developing the world. And in the world today, the growth part of the world economy comes from the developing world.
Let me go to you, Dr. Stanton. When you say alternative ways, do you think there are something that has already in a way coming out, trying to suggest what the BRICS leaders have? After all, the Chinese president, during his speech at the Leaders Summit, he talked about opening market. He also talked about trade wars is going to be the worst situation. After all, this is a country that is in trade war with the United States. So what are these rhetorics coming, or the ways that the Chinese put it to the rest of the BRICS countries? Help us to understand what can BRICS do together.
I think, do I keep talking?
Go ahead, Mr. Staden.
Do I keep talking?
Yes, go ahead, keep talking.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mr. Staden having problems hearing me. Now let me go back to you, Professor Fu, about that as well. We sometimes have some problems with South Africa when it comes to the quality of the link. But Professor Fu, tell me about that. The two things Chinese president talked about: opening trade, opening market. He also talking about the recent trade issues and say trade wars are the worst situation. Is there any signal coming out of his remarks?
Well, the United States, Donald Trump has been engaged in very high-handed unilateral moves in a way to gain more advantage from the global system. So in that sense, China has been facing a great challenge from that part. But at the end of the day, in the long term, it makes sense for China to open its economy, because it's through opening that we can make our products more competitive. And that's the lesson that China should learn from the past 40 years of reforms and opening up. So opening is will continue to be a major theme of the Chinese economy.
I hope many say we hope that there is going to be more concrete actions regarding that. We'll see how things are working. Stay with us on World Insight. We'll have more discussions on the influence of the BRICS Summit right after this break. Welcome back. For more on the BRICS Summit, we are joined by two further guests, not only Dr. Van Staden, Professor Fu Jun, but also in London we have Alexander Nekrasov, who is a former Kremlin advisor. In Taipei, we have Madhav Nalapat, the UNESCO Peace Chair and Director of the Geopolitics in International Relations Department, Manipal University. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the four of you. Quite a lineup, but I guess the most important thing is the content, isn't it? Professor Nalapat, now you see the trade war go on. What does it mean for the economies of the BRICS countries? After all, they're all emerging countries. They may face very similar challenges. From India's perspective, is there any chance for cooperation within this group?
Well, I'd like to say that yes, there is a lot of scope for cooperation within this group. And in India and China in particular, and India and Russia in particular. Prime Minister Modi has had very comprehensive discussions, including, I believe, in Johannesburg, with President Xi and President Putin. The fact of the matter is that what is happening vis-a-vis the United States is now convincing the other large economies that trade war is not a solution for them. It's actually going to be a problem. So I think it's a good lesson in what not to do. So from that point of view, it's been beneficial. So far as China is concerned, I think China has the resilience to overcome the issues that have been created in the short run by this kind of policy on the part of the Trump administration.
Well, Mr. Nekrasov, from Russia's perspective, there seems to be quite a number of things that the BRICS economies could do together. I mean, right now, for example, China is not necessarily importing soybeans, meat, and some of the other agricultural products coming from the United States. The other emerging economies, such as the BRICS, though, can be the provider of all these possibilities. So do you think there's much common ground from Russia's perspective? And by the way, Russia and the United States have not necessarily recently on good terms with the canceling of the trip by President Trump of Russian president to visit the United States.
Well, I think that from the point of view of the BRICS countries, they will be coming together more closely in the view of the general position of the West towards the world, of the American position. I think that we should all remember one very important thing. The Western liberal model of the economics is dead. It's finished. It's an agony. The BRICS countries have to start slowly distancing themselves from this liberal economics, because they will involve, if they adopt that same model, they will probably have huge problems on their hands. And that is why, by the way, America is so aggressive, because their model is not working. Europe, by the way, is in a very, very difficult situation, because financially it is practically bankrupt. So what I'm saying here, that BRICS countries, by definition, need to work together more closely, but not forgetting politically as well. I don't think they are united politically. A very important point. And also another very important point, information-wise. BRICS countries do not dictate the new agendas. Apart from CGTN, which is doing a very good job on the information market, the world market, the other countries are not doing anything to project their agendas information-wise. And they are adopting Western-style information, which is damaging them.
All right. Dr. Van Staden, I was told by my colleague that we can talk to you now. Can you hear me? If yes, say yes. Wonderful.
Yes, I can, yes.
What do you make of the points made by Mr. Nekrasov earlier, that there is a lack of coordination about economic, political, and information? Do you agree with him? We seem once again having problems about our South Africa link. Obviously, the links among the BRICS countries has to be strengthened when it comes to information. Coming back to you, Professor Fu, about that too.
I wouldn't go as far as say their model has been broken. Here we have an alternative model. I would say there are probably two different models there. Their model is to continue to push the very frontier of human knowledge to continue to go forward, whereas a more appropriate model for BRIC countries are the model of catching up. So it will be important for the global system to remain open. So under conditions of openness, it's better for us, more easy for us to close the technology gap between advanced economies and the less economies. We have the resources, we have the people. When you multiply those key factors with the powerful technology variable, and it's a recipe for continued growth.
There's always the potential, but the question is how to do it, and are they being done? That is the issue, isn't it? Professor Nalapat, let me go to you once again. The BRICS countries, there's not only BRICS, but also SCO and also G20. India, Russia, China, many of it are part of those regional and also issue-driven platforms. Can the BRICS countries collaborate on a comprehensive way and come up with a systematic approach to some of the most important challenges of the world, particularly regarding emerging economy? I think that is the key question. Rhetoric is one thing, action is another.
No, you're perfectly right, and the fact is that unfortunately there have been some very low expectations from BRICS, and this is actually coming from Western societies who frankly are very unhappy about the entire BRICS model, and they feel it's a wonder that BRICS has survived. The fact is BRICS has got to be much more aggressive in pushing an alternative agenda, and that would mean, for example, easier trade between the BRICS countries. For example, currency, you can have a situation in which each other's currencies would be tradable within the BRICS bloc. And in terms of visas, we still have a lot of problems, for example, between Russia and India. Now these, I think, need to be addressed. So I think BRICS should set a good example. And one way would be for the leaders at Johannesburg to accelerate the pace of change, especially regarding visas, especially regarding free trade. And I think from that point of view, if this session works in that way, it will be a tremendous lesson for the rest of the world. As you said, BRICS is an extremely important bloc.
It is an extremely important, but the thing is how to make use of it for the better of all. Dr. Van Staden, let me try one more time, and my last time to go with you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes, I can hear you.
So glad to have you back, sir. Earlier, your colleague had been talking about how to translate this great consensus into real actions with the backdrop of real trade wars, if not ideological divides. So, Dr. Van Staden, can the BRICS be able to lead the way, or at least be one of those leaders in figuring out some solutions? Go ahead, sir.
I think it is possible. One of the interesting themes of this year's BRICS Summit has been South Africa's attempt to try and pull in more African nations. So I think, there's been a lot of discussion about the possibility of the BRICS Plus model of possibly enlarging the grouping. And it might be very valuable to think about what kind of other perspectives can be pulled in order to coordinate better between the members. At present, the African continent has just started its own continental free trade agreement. It's one of the largest free trade zones in the world. So it might be a very good time for BRICS to think about the possibility of working more closely with other African nations except for South Africa, and to see if there's a way of combining the move towards free trade that is happening in Africa with the trade needs of the BRICS bloc.
Professor Fu, in Beijing, you work a lot on the Africa issue. Do you agree with what Mr. Van Staden just said?
Well, he made a very important point. Point number one, he said we need to work more closely within the group, but in addition of that, we should explore ways also for African countries to reach, for South Africa countries to reach the Africa continent. So it's very important. We should not sort of look at the BRIC countries as an isolated group, well, as a sequencing of policies. It probably makes sense for us to get closer. Then you also need to spread those experience and encourage other countries also to open up markets and have more trades. Trade will encourage competitiveness of economies, and it has been proven both theoretically and empirically.
Okay. When you look at these countries, the BRICS countries, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, Russia, some suggest that these countries could be in competition right now, particularly when there is a backdrop of the trade war, because they could all come out and say we have better advantage over the others. But if you look closely at these economies, they're actually quite different. China, for example, based more on manufacturing, export-oriented. Russia, not necessarily so. Brazil, pretty much on agriculture, not necessarily manufacturing. India is still on its way to open up its market. So you see there are South Africa as well, as our guest earlier talking about a African continent free trade possibility. So you see this very different advantages that every one of those BRICS nations have within this group and also over the other countries in the other parts of the world. Mr. Nekrasov, do you agree with that kind of view? If that could be so to a certain extent, what should be the next step? Can the next step be done? That is the question.
Well, I think you can say that yes, these countries can work together. These countries can work together. They can work together even better than the Western countries are working with themselves. I think the important thing is that these countries of BRICS and the others that are probably hoping to join them do not have one problem that demonizes the Western economy. They have not created a virtual economy, which is the financial markets, that are now undermining and distracting trillions of dollars from the real economies of the West. That is their huge advantage. For example, Russia could withstand the financial crisis because it has a very, very small financial sector, financial markets. And it could manipulate and it could get out of that mess. China should be very careful and not follow the example of Western countries as well. So if we, together, the BRICS countries, avoid this virtual economy, which is a huge black hole, which sucks in trillions of dollars and destroys basically the proper economy, we will have a better future than the West.
Well, the new development bank, of course, is the one of a development institution set up by all BRICS countries. Mr. Nalapat, before we go, can that be a model for other BRICS-wide cooperation happen? But the question is when and where?
Well, I'd like to say that I think the Chinese have set a good example. They are by far the largest economy in BRICS. Now, when Bretton Woods took place, the United States insisted on controlling the World Bank, and the Europeans insisted on controlling the IMF. And basically, both these institutions are jointly controlled by the Atlantic Alliance. So far as the new institutions that have been set up, in large part because of the fact that the Chinese have been very helpful in this, in these institutions, the role of China is not dominant. The role of China is important, but is not dominant. And from that point of view, I think China has set up a good example of what is called win-win. So I think we should look for win-win, and we should avoid the zero-sum concepts of the West. And let's not forget, the West's zero-sum conquests and concepts made Asia very poor. And it's only after removing them that Asia is now coming back into the front rank of countries.
I see. Professor Nalapat, Mr. Nekrasov, Dr. Van Staden, and Professor Fu Jun, thank you so much for being with us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. An easing of trade tensions, really, between the United States and the European Union? We'll ask about their efforts to steer away a full-scale trade war. But can it really be done already? Right after this break. Welcome back. Let's move on to recent global trade tensions. Trade between the United States and the European Union remain a bone of contention. Both sides have suffered from tariffs they imposed on each other. To avoid a full-scale trade war, U.S. President Donald Trump and his counterpart, the head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, held talks in Washington on Wednesday. Before we get down to the business of exactly what that meeting meant and the agreement that they wished upon really mean to the rest of the world, let's take a look at what the leaders really have been talking about in that meeting.
the President of the United States.
The U.S. and the EU stepped back from the brink of an all-out trade war. In a meeting between their heads, the two sides agreed on a plan to defuse trade tensions.
This is why we agreed today, first of all, to work together towards zero tariffs. We will also work to reduce barriers and increase trade in services, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, medical products, as well as soybeans. Soybeans is a big deal.
Both sides said they would work to resolve issues with Washington's metal duties. Under the agreement, the U.S. will not follow through with the threat to impose tariffs on vehicles from the EU. The EU also said it would increase imports of U.S. soybeans and liquefied natural gas.
Europe is prepared to work with all like-minded partners to create new opportunities and to improve the global system itself. Whatever future lies ahead, our partnership with the United States must continue to be a driving force for both sides and for the world.
Earlier, Mr. Trump placed tariffs on imported steel and aluminum and threatened to slap new tariffs on the automobile industry. The EU retaliated in kind on over $3 billion worth of American goods. Stung with U.S. tariffs, the EU and another affected American trade partner, Japan, signed free trade deals and agreed to remove tariffs on around 99% of products last week. Despite the de-escalation of tit-for-tat tariffs between Washington and Brussels, the U.S. still facing increasing domestic criticism and counter-duties levied by other countries, including American neighbors Canada and Mexico, and biggest trading partner, China.
For more on the meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Juncker, we are joined in our Beijing studio Zhang Gong, who is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, sir, to our program.
Thank you.
And joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Steve Pruitt, who is a managing partner of Watts Partner, also a former staff director of Committee on Budget of the U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome, too. Let me go to you, Mr. Pruitt, first about the latest trade, not necessarily agreement, but a deal. Is it a truce or is it a peace agreement between the U.S. and the EU?
How about a different term? It's a press release that says we're going to continue to talk, and that it lays out at least an agreement to talk about some specific issues, which I think at the end of the day may well prove good. But I think the problem here is we've been dealing with a situation where policy is being developed by bluff, and you can only do so many head fakes in the international arena before folks start to understand your moves. And I think the script and the likely choreography of a Trump effort here is becoming clearer to our world players.
I see.
I think lastly, we need to stop focusing so much on the manipulation here and what the actual outcomes are. And I think many people in the world have done that, and many sectors of the U.S. economy are now also beginning to focus on outcomes versus the manipulation that they're seeing.
Right.
It's not enough to applaud Donald Trump for standing up, quote unquote, for America. It's more important for him to deliver for America, and I think the sooner we start seeing results, the better off everyone will be.
Got it. Professor Gong, also from Beijing, you are watching this on the sideline, of course, from Beijing. While there's a trade war going on between China and the United States, apparently. Therefore, what does this mean to China, if you look at it as an observer? Is this going to be what Mr. Pruitt said, just a press release, or more good things to come, at least for EU and the U.S.?
Well, I totally agree. It is indeed a press release. I mean, look at the substance of this deal they just announced. What the U.S. gives up is the threat of imposing tariff on German imports of cars. It's just a threat, okay, in exchange for promises of selling soybeans as well as LNG to the European market. So, you know, this is, and there's, of course, they say they're going to work on reaching some kind of a deal on the issue of tariffs on steel and aluminum. So, you know, history tells us that this guy, Mr. President Donald Trump, is very good at flip-flopping things.
Yes.
I mean, thing can be totally turned around by a tweet tomorrow morning. So, and remember when Steve Mnuchin came to China, we sort of reached an agreement, and he said that we have an agreement. But, when he go back to U.S., Washington, D.C., things start to change.
But, Professor Gong, China also knows it very well. It is not Mr. Mnuchin that is calling the shot in Washington, or rather in the White House, it's President Trump that he insists on calling every shot about everything at any time. So let me come back to our discussion with another guest joining us from the EU countries, one of those. In Edinburgh, we have Kristen Hopewell, a senior lecturer of international political economy at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome to our program, Professor Hopewell. What is your take? Earlier, my American guest said it's a press release. Our Chinese guest said, well, this is very skeptical, actually. It could just be a totally different document in the future. So what exactly is it to you?
Well, I think to the extent that this could work to help avert a trade war between the U.S. and EU, that would be extremely beneficial and extremely significant. If we look at the substance of this preliminary agreement to negotiate between the U.S. and EU, it is fairly limited. One of the key aspects, the commitment on both sides to try to reduce their industrial tariffs. The reality is that industrial tariffs between the U.S. and EU are already extremely low, so there's relatively little room to reduce them further. Another major victory Trump is claiming with his agreement is the EU agreeing to consume more U.S. soybeans.
Yes.
But the reality is that that's something that's already happening already because the U.S. is facing increased tariffs on its soybean exports to China, which is its biggest market for its soybean exports. The price of U.S. soybeans has fallen. They're effectively shut out of the Chinese market. So instead, that's made U.S. soybeans at a lower price more attractive in the European market. So we're seeing trade diversion from the Chinese market to the European market with U.S. soybeans. But ultimately, these are things that are happening on their own.
Yeah,
so
but how about liquefied natural gas? That's also one of those items apparently in this deal.
Yeah, and the LNG exports, I mean, this is something that the EU is looking to increase anyways. If you look at the EU is trying to reduce its dependence on Russian energy. It also has its own domestic supply constraints. So over time, they're looking to increase their LNG imports. This is something that will be happening regardless of this deal between the U.S. and EU.
Is it just a matter of convenience, really, Mr. Pruitt? I mean, we've been hearing since the very beginning, President Trump came into the office, and people have been brushing off whatever he is suggesting or whatever his decisions or his rhetorics. But eventually, some say he's getting somewhere. So can we still be as skeptical about this as we used to be about him or his trade policies?
Well, I first and foremost have an issue with defining what is going on as a policy or a doctrine. I just don't see a plan afoot. It's more of checking a box that something he promised during the campaign to do, and he's going to do it regardless of the outcome.
If that is the case, Mr. Pruitt, let me put it in another way. Out of the American political context, that is, how would you compare this apparent verbal deal between the EU and the U.S. to the real deal that the EU has signed with Japan when it comes to free trade agreement?
Well, first, it's not a deal. Secondly, there's no dollars reflected in this. There's no quantities reflected in this. All the elements that you would expect to see, quote unquote, in a deal or a contract are missing. It's just, it's not enough substance to really whet the appetite, if you will, in my view.
Okay, and let me come back to you, Professor Gong, here in China. You see the two sides try to continue what they call a dialogue to reduce differences on regulations, standards, and things like that. But the question is, there is a deficit that the U.S. have with the EU 152B, and we do not know whether President Trump, pumping his chest, likely to give what kinds of a solution, and what would this mean, the current situation for China and the EU to work on the trade issues.
Okay, so let's first talk about your first question.
Go ahead, sir.
Well, you said pounding his chest. Well, that's what he actually exactly did when he had this discussion with the European leaders. And it's in front of the world cameras. He was pounding the table, telling the Germans that they shouldn't have this pipeline to Russia, and Germany being a captive of Russia. And pay very keen attention to the press release today. The EU side said that they're going to build a LNG facility in Europe, provided that the price is right and competitive. So there's actually a lot of strings attached to this deal. So I'm not very sure that eventually really Europe is going to rely on American LNG as opposed to importing natural gas from Russia. This pipeline is still working, I think. It's still under progress. The deficit issue. Let's talk about the deficit issue from U.S. perspective. The deficit is fundamentally decided by Americans' fiscal policy. As long as there's such a huge fiscal policy, because of this tax reduction, and God knows how many more billions of dollars going to add into the trade deficit, the fiscal deficit, and also provided that
deficit with all the economies, China,
right.
Japan, the EU, and many others. The list goes on. Having said that, though, let me go back to you, Mr. Pruitt, about one thing. We see this interesting verbal look-alike deal. If you don't want to say it's a deal, that is happening right after, one day after, the Trump administration decided to give $12 billion of compensation to the U.S. farmers as a result of the trade war the U.S. is having with China. It is also on the same day that the Trump administration, President Trump himself, suggested that he's going to delay that meeting he's going to have with President Putin in fall rather. So how should we piece all of these information together? Is this about really trade deals, or is this about just calming the forces inside Washington, who has been expressing their strong opposition against his presidency over the past 2 weeks?
Well, it's definitely about calming the voices in Washington. The problem is it doesn't respond to the people outside of Washington. And to suggest that $12 billion can undo or in some way mitigate the damage that has already been done is a bit of a misnomer. And I would also suggest that it's probably not going to work because it's not going to be able to be easily administered. And in the U.S., the discussion is already talking about the line that will be forming at the door, if you will, for additional relief. So this is not a good scenario in total. Even to put out $12 billion that we're now going to have to go borrow from our good friends in China to repay at some date in the future. It's not a good deal overall, and that's why politically he's backed off of it.
I see. Professor Hopewell, within the EU there are a lot of fights going on right now as we speak about what exactly UNCA has agreed to. After all, the EU countries have to all agree about one thing before that one thing becomes official. So what exactly is the political motive for Mr. Juncker going there and say, well, today I want to have a deal with you, and it seems that we are having a deal, at least in the words that he used, Professor Hopewell?
Well, I think this potentially has symbolic value. If it enables this preliminary agreement to negotiate the U.S. and EU, as we've discussed, the substance of this agreement is relatively limited. But if it has a symbolic value in enabling Trump to pull back from the cliff edge of a trade war with the EU, to undo the tariffs on European steel and aluminum, to avoid placing new tariffs on European auto imports, then that would be extremely significant. If this is enough to actually avert that trade war, that would be incredibly meaningful. I think, though, the question is whether Trump is credible, whether he's reliable. As has been discussed, his behavior has been extremely erratic. There's tons of U-turns constantly on trade policy from Trump. So the question is whether he actually intends to stick with this agreement, or as we saw with his, he told us the U.S. and China were negotiating to avert a trade war. He said that trade war was on hold, and then just days later reversed course and is now proposing to put tariffs on $500 billion worth of Chinese imports. So the question is whether Trump is really committed to seeing this agreement through, to trying to avoid a trade war, or if we're just going to see another flip-flop from him down the road.
I see. Professor Gong, here in China, most people are thinking about, okay, whether a deal or not the U.S. is having with the EU, apparently they're trying to send a message together, at least for now. But what would that mean, Professor Gong, for China? After all, China is in a big trade dispute with the United States. So what's likely to be the message China gets and move forward about this, which is with the United States and also with the EU?
Well, I think that our Foreign Ministry spokesman has said that they're happy to see some kind of agreement reached between the European side and the U.S. side. But I think under the table, I think the government is probably a little bit concerned that with this issues resolved, if it's going to be resolved, that it probably mitigates a lot of burden, a lot of pressure on Donald Trump in dealing with China. And certainly it actually it increases more pressure on the Chinese side. But regardless of what's happening between United States and the European side, and I think that China's trade deficit with the U.S. is a problem that we have to address. And some of the issues that they have raised regarding our China's structural problems are also something in our interest to address anyway. So I think I am hopeful that two sides can come to the negotiating table and work things out. And especially at the highest level between Donald Trump and President Xi. If that's what he wants, let's go for that.
Well, I'm not sure whether the promise you made will exactly be the promise that's coming from the Chinese leadership. But for now, thank you so much, Professor Gong, for joining us. We want to thank the three of you for being with us. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.